The Manchester Man by Mrs. George Linnaeus Banks. Chapter 36. The Lover's Walk. Jabez held a responsible post, and had no more leisure than other businessmen for emotional indulgence. He hurried out of the cottage and down the avenue, shutting up his bitter feelings within the door of his heart as he went. But the process closed his eyes and ears to external sounds, and the old postman with his long tin horn, which had been echoing through the straggling village a full quarter of an hour, passed him in the avenue and said "Good day," without so much as arresting his attention. At the mill he found letters waiting. One, which had been post-paid as a double letter, conspicuous amongst the Wayford business communications, not only because of its thick gilt-edged paper and crimson disc of crested wax, but from its curious folding, as if to baffle prying eyes. It was signed Ben Travis, and was so long it went into a pantaloon pocket, to be read when his multifarious duties allowed him more leisure. When the hands were dismissed at noon, and the one clerk had left the counting-house, he took out the voluminous epistle, which was dated September the 10th, and certainly found therein matter of interest. Amongst a few preliminary items of news, he learned that the excesses of the coronation night had created so much disgust in the minds of thinking men, that many of those who had denounced Henry Hunt's advocacy of abstinence, and at the public expense, had formally disseminated printed laudations of good brown ale, the old English beverage, as a cheering and strengthening drink, no longer branded the water drinkers as enemies to the corporeal constitution of Englishmen, but had given their countenance to social gatherings whence intoxicating liquors were excluded. Travis himself was doing what he could to promote these temperate meetings, and looked for the earnest cooperation of Mr. Clegg on his return to Manchester, and reformers saw in advance how universal would become the temperance movement, of which this was the unpretending precursor. The letter went on to say, Miss Chadwick and her fair cousins were spirited away mysteriously. At first I blamed myself as the unhappy cause. I have since discovered my mistake, through a quarrel between Mr. Walmsley and Mr. Lawrence Aspinall, when both were slaves to Bacchus, vino veritas. I suppose you know that Mr. Aspinall the elder is a martyr to the gout, and has been driven by his enemy to the Buxton Baths. The cause, I have heard, was a gentlemanly debauch in a fit of passion or wounded pride. His son joins him to-day. I scarcely think he will call on your young ladies after what has occurred." "What has occurred?" repeated Jabez. "What can he mean by that? I wish correspondence would be more explicit." He pondered over this sentence, but could make nothing of it, and after reading a little way came to the real object of the letter, prefaced as it was with more circumlocution. "It may seem strange that a great big burly fellow like myself should be such a booby as to seek the intervention of a third person in an affair of the heart. Yet, if I have any insight into your nature, I think I may confide in you, and depend on your good offices. After so many months' dangling and craven hesitation, I summoned up courage to make my pretensions known to Miss Chadwick. I know I did it clumsily and ungracefully. The very strength of my passion fettered my tongue. I shall never forget the pitiful look of the sweet girl as she burst into tears, assured me of her esteem, but declined my suit. Her tears unnerved me, and I had not power to plead my own cause. Do not despise me, Clegg. Neither Samson nor Hercules was any stronger. I cannot resign myself to that verdict. I would throw myself again at Ellen's feet, and beseech her pity, but that I dread its repetition. Can I count on your good offices to move her in my behalf? I know the value Miss Chadwick sets on your opinion, and how highly she esteems you, or I should not think of asking this. The trust I repose in you is the best proof I can give of friendship. Do not hesitate to tell me the worst. I hope I am brave enough to bear my fate when I know it. Mrs. Chadwick does not believe her daughter's decision final. This was a disquieting letter. Mr. Travis had been his firm true friend, in spite of difference in position and fortune. He had overlooked that difference from the first, but would Miss Chadwick, his employer's niece, overlook it, if he stepped beyond privileged bounds? From the depths of his own conscious heart, he felt grieved for his friend, but how to approach so delicate a subject to serve him was perplexing. He never thought of shirking the trust. It was late when he got home to dinner. Ellen and Bess were both on the lookout for him. He quickened his pace, fearing some evil to his beloved Augusta, whom he had last seen in tears. What an anomaly is woman, he thought, as he found her fingers rattling over the keys of her piano in accompaniment to the merriest ditty he had heard from her lips since she was a child. There was a strange sparkle in her eyes, a vivacity in her manner, so opposed to her sadness, that he asked himself if he had been dreaming before, or was dreaming then. She blushed over her willow-pattern plate as she took her seat, but after the first token of susceptibility, chatted with a volubility unusual to her, and curiously in contradistinction to the silence and reserve of Ellen Chadwick. In the morning he had debated whether that secret trouble came within the category of unusual things Mrs. Ashton required to be informed of, and behold, it was gone. She railed both Ellen and Jabez on their gravity, and at length, as if on a sudden inspiration, asked, playing with her green-handled two-pronged fork, "Shall you be very busy at the mill this afternoon, Mr. Clegg?" It was an unusual question. He answered, "Rather. Some bales of twist have come in from Messrs. Evans of Darley Abbey Mills. I must see them unpacked and compare the twists with samples." "But your motive for asking?" "Oh, if you are busy, well, perhaps after tea will be better. It will be cooler. I wish you would just take Ellen a good long walk. I found her fainting with the heat this morning." Ellen coloured vividly. "Augusta," she remonstrated. "And yourself, Miss Ashton?" questioned he. "Oh, I have a heap of clear starching to do. My frills and laces are in a woeful plight. I shall be clap, clap, clap all the afternoon, and this sultry weather prohibits ironing until there is a cool evening breeze to fan me through the window. Without it I should be as likely to faint as Ellen." Miss Chadwick made light of her faintness, and objected, if not too strenuously, to be so disposed of. But Augusta in her own wilful way insisted, and Jabez, with his friend's letter on his mind, was not likely to throw opposition in the way. So, notwithstanding his recent rebuff, he was once more Miss Ashton's humble servant to command. After an early tea, which was but a fiction to all three, Augusta was left behind, busy with her box iron and her ladylike laundry of lace and muslin in the house-place, whilst Ellen Chadwick and Jabez went rambling with the winding waters of the translucent Goyt, under umbrageous trees on pleasant mountain slopes where foxgloves nodded and horsetail grasses bent before them, and only an occasional reaper or gleaner crossed their path. Had these two been incipient lovers, no more embarrassing silence could have fallen upon them. If Jabez, her junior by 2 years, had had a tussle to keep his love within bounds, there had at least been a glimmer of hope in the distance, and the struggle was upwards. Ellen had been trained from her childhood to keep her naturally strong feelings under control, but there was a war in her breast between maidenly shame and unsought, hopeless love, and the two hacked at each other and at her heart in the rayless dark, and the struggle was downwards. Here she was, for the first time, alone with the man she loved, with all the strength of a strong heart, with the newly gained knowledge that he would die to save her cousin pain, and he, conscious of a sacred and delicate mission, all unaware of her secret love for himself, was perplexed how best to approach the subject and take advantage of the opportunity so afforded him. At length, "I had a letter from my friend Captain Travis today," he began. With little perceptible emotion she replied, "Indeed, I hope he was in good health. You are honoured in your friendship, sir. Mr. Travis is a noble gentleman, and I esteem him highly." This paved the way for him to expatiate on Ben Travis's many good qualities. He told the story of the big raw-boned youth's first patronage of himself, and found an attentive listener as he traced the growth of their friendship upwards and related favourable anecdotes which have no place in this history. But no sooner did he begin to plead his friend's cause with all the warmth of young friendship than her manner entirely changed. Her colour came and went. She panted as if for breath, and gasping out, "Oh, Mr. Clegg, for mercy's sake, don't!" was seized with a sudden faintness for the second time that day. A lichen-covered old tree trunk, shattered and uptorn in the late thunderstorms, was at hand. He seated her upon it, bringing water to revive her from a runnel near, but any attempt to renew the subject only seemed to give her exquisite pain, and he desisted on her telling him, in a suffocating voice, "Honour forbids that I should listen to Mr. Travis. I love another." Something in her tone or manner told him that her love was as hopeless as his own for Augusta, and nothing could be more respectful and gentle than his bearing towards her on their homeward way, thus adding fuel to the fire which consumed her. The evening shadows were fast closing in when they reached the cottage, and she, with a simple inclination of the head, left Jabez on the threshold, and, passing through the parlours, carried her overmastering emotions upwards to her room to be grappled with in the silence of the night. "Where's Miss Ashton?" asked Bess. "Who said it were too hot to bide in th' house, and who put her irons down, and after titivating herself oop a bit, went out a-seeking you?" In some surprise not unmixed with alarm, for the hour was late, as times and country went, and the harvest brought rough strangers into the neighbourhood, Jabez set off at full speed down the avenue, and ere he had reached the first brook, saw her lithe figure advancing buoyantly, and, if his eyes and the gathering mist did not deceive him, a second figure parted from her at the gate. She was the first to speak. "Whichever way did you people ramble off?" "Oh, down by the Goyt, Tatsel way, Miss Ashton," answered Jabez. "Ah, and I went up the Buxton road. We were certain to miss." "I thought I saw you part from someone at the gate. Could I be mistaken?" half questioned her interlocutor. "Oh, Crazy Joe, that was all," and he took a reply in all sincerity, not believing Augusta Ashton capable of untruth. A day or two went by, during which Jabez wrote to tell Ben Travis he must arm himself with fortitude, that the world was full of disappointments, that Miss Chadwick loved elsewhere, but there was something more for men to do than die of disappointments or blighted love. And yet another day or two, during which Augusta's moods were as variable as the gusty shadows of the sycamore, changing from wild exuberance, which rallied Ellen in her depression, and condescended to play or dance for Syme, to a moping, moody melancholy, enlivened by frequent showers. She was given to snatch up her hat and run out into the garden for a breath of fresh air, but she generally came in panting, as if the run had been literal, and sometimes she would be found in the house when supposed out of it, and vice versa. The White Hart had not yet walked away, although Jabez considered it complete. He waited Mr. Ashton's coming and his verdict, and stood the easel in the dining-room. The Morning Post had brought a message to Simon Clegg concerning fruit and vegetables for the Manchester home, and having sought him in the kitchen garden to deliver it, Jabez entered the house at dinner-time by the lower staircase window, frequently used for entrance and exit. His passage through the best parlour was arrested by voices in the room beyond, one of which he knew too well. It was that of Lawrence Aspinall. His painting was evidently under free criticism, and had been for some time. There was some jesting at the sign painter. "You see, Miss Ashton, what a few touches can effect." The speaker had apparently made free with Clegg's colours and brushes, and there was a murmured sound of assent from Miss Ashton. "Well, Barrett, next skier fas et omnia," ne suter ultra crepidam. We are not allowed to know all things, shoemaker, not above the sandal. What say you? Yes, let the cobbler stick to his last. If this Clegg would be an artist, let him stick to his brush. If a tradesman, let him stick to his trade. If a man means to succeed, he must never flirt with either art or trade. It's just as bad as wooing 2 women at once. Jabez heard no more. The blow which had been aimed at his art pretensions drove him back by the way he came, and he paced the long terrace parallel with the Lovers' Walk for fully half an hour. When he turned the corner of the cottage and went in at the front door, the critics were gone, but Aspinall's few touches remained. They had indeed given life to the White Hart. Henceforth the cobbler resolved to stick to his last. Ellen Chadwick had been away, with little Syme by the hand, to take some substantial comforts to Meg's bedridden mother. She appeared annoyed when she heard of their masculine visitors from Buxton. Her evident displeasure set Jabez wondering what Travis meant by "after what has occurred," and he wrote that afternoon for enlightenment, sending his letter as a packet by coach, there being no second post. It has been said that the cellarage of the cottage was only accessible by flights of steps in the portion of the weed-grown Lovers' Walk, which lay at the windowless back of the long low building, where nettles grew so thick and rank that even the square unused trap over one set of steps was half hidden by them. The path was rarely used, the farmer having made a nearer cut from the farmyard to his ancient dwelling. Tom Hume was slowly recovering under the care of a Buxton doctor who came thrice a week. He could walk about the garden with a stick, but there was no sending him to the dark cellar for anything. The doctor had ordered him port wine, and Bess, who kept the key, had asked Mr. Clegg to fetch a couple of bottles from the cellar. Tea was over, but he fancied there was sufficient light to guide him without a lantern. He had got the wine, and was approaching the cellar door at the foot of the sunken steps, when he heard the sound of voices coming along the walk from the direction of the moor. Every pulse in his body seemed to grow still as he recognised the tones of Augusta Ashton and Lawrence Aspinall, and heard with deepening anguish the unmistakable sound of kisses interchanged. They had apparently paused close to the stairhead for that embrace, and then he heard, and thanked God that he was there to hear, though that hearing blighted every hope he had, his rival with every argument which passionate love or skilful sophistry could employ, persuade her to elope with him the following night. Backwards and forwards they walked in the gathering dusk, but never beyond the length of the premises, and now and then they stopped and drove him mad with their caresses. The place was so retired and lonely, precaution was neglected, and Jabez, chained to the spot as it were, gathered that proposals for her hand, made by Lawrence himself, had been peremptorily rejected by Mr. Ashton, who was set down as a despot and a tyrant for refusing to surrender a silly girl of 17 to a rake of 22. He heard her tell that Jabez Clegg had found her sobbing at the separation, even whilst her darling's letter was at the gate, and he heard it said that the elder Aspinall not only countenanced this secret courtship, but had furnished funds for the proposed elopement. This generosity was set against the cruelty of her 2 parents. Her affection, her pride, the romance in her nature were appealed to, but still Augusta's better angel held her safe, until, coward that he was, Lawrence terrified her with a threat to blow his brains out if she refused him. She wept her assent upon his breast, and then Jabez, already half stunned, heard the details of evidently previously concocted arrangements for their elopement and marriage at Gretna Green, professedly with his father's sanction. Chapter 37. A Ride on a Rainy Night. Jabez, bottles in hand, his mind a chaos, had walked in at the wash-kitchen door, precisely as Augusta, stealthily creeping through a gap in the privet hedge, made her way to the convenient staircase window, shivering more from fright than from the chill, drizzling rain which had begun to fall. Putting her head in at the parlour door, where Ellen was sewing, with a brief "I'm off to bed," she hurried upstairs in the dust to lave her flushed face, smooth her disordered hair, crush it under a nightcap, and place her head on a pillow to still her heart's flutterings under the screening counterpane, and hide her emotions from her cousin under the semblance of sleep, though sleep was an absolute impossibility. In 1821 the village of Gretna Green on the Scottish border was the general resort of runaway lovers, who, being in their minority, could not be married legally in England without parental consent, whereas in Caledonia a mere promise to marry, made in the presence of witnesses, was held binding. At Gretna, a man not in holy orders, but metaphorically called the blacksmith, because he riveted the chains of matrimony, lived in the first house beyond the bridge which spanned the river Sark, and, with a ceremonial as unseemly as it was brief, married all comers, often with pursuers at his very doors, and the marriages so contracted were not to be set aside. For more than half a century, Gretna Green weddings had figured largely in the literature of the stage and of the circulating library, and there is no doubt that the halo of romance thrown around an elopement to Gretna blinded to the impropriety of the prenuptial flight many a foolish or headstrong girl whom the actual ceremony shocked and startled. Augusta Ashton, with all her sentimental romance, all her petulant wilfulness, all her resentment at being exiled from home, and her Adonis, yet loved her parents well, although her reverence and filial obedience had been gradually undermined by the plausible sophistry and impassioned eloquence of her ardent lover. But if she loved them much, she unfortunately loved Lawrence more. He was, to do him justice, terribly in earnest, and in the experience of her 17 years, she could not be expected to sift and analyse that passionate earnestness from its many components. With her all was love, and love was all. His proposition had, nevertheless, come upon her with a shock. She was not prepared to ignore the prudent teachings of her mother, or to brave the indignation of her indulgent father, or to forfeit her own self-respect, and nothing could have moved her to consent but that appalling threat of suicide, and he knew her tender heart well when he made it. But neither that threat nor her promise could reconcile her to the rash step, and she lay in bed shuddering with her own fears, and strangely enough her first thought was, what would Jabez say if he knew it? Not her father, not her mother, but the Jabez whom she had rebuffed only a week before, yet of whose opinion she somehow stood more in awe than of all else besides. What did Jabez think? Seeing that he did not know. Think? He scarcely could think. Feelings seemed to overpower thought, reason, perception. When after a stagnant time he emerged from the stairhead, it was more as a culprit than Jabez Clegg. He put down the bottles and escaped again into the open air, cowed alike by the knowledge which had overpowered him, and by a sense of dishonour at having played the unworthy part of a listener, albeit the listening had been involuntary, seeing that the shock of his discovery had stunned him like a blow from a sledgehammer, crushing his own long-cherished hopes to death. His next thought was of intense thankfulness that by any means the schemes of Aspinall had been bared to him, and in time to attempt the rescue of his idolised Augusta from the clutches of a villain. Unacquainted with the events which had preceded Augusta's removal to Carr, unaware that the Mosley Street doors had been closed against Lawrence, or that a formal proposal for the young lady's hand had been made by the elder Aspinall on behalf of his son, and peremptorily declined by the Ashtons, ignorant that imperious Mr. Aspinall in his gouty wrath had sworn upon his honour that his son should marry the girl in spite of the paltry beggar's inkle weaver, and having no faith in the man himself, Jabez regarded the use of the father's name only as a proof of his greater perfidy, and gave him no credit even for an honourable intention or an honest emotion. The time was past for Clegg to find excuses for the wrongdoing of his adversary. Now, with every nerve unstrung, he was required to act, and that promptly. Tomorrow would be too late. What if he should take Miss Chadwick into his confidence? But no, he could not lure Augusta in the eyes even of her own cousin, and neither she nor anyone there had authority to detain Miss Ashton against her will, even if her foot were on the step of the post-chaise. It was imperative that he should reach Manchester immediately, yet how to do so without exciting alarm perplexed him. There was a horse in the stable at the mill, but as he had a bed in Simon's room, and could neither leave it nor return to it in the night without passing through the Humes' sleeping apartment, there was a difficulty in quitting the house unknown. I must be at the mill before daybreak tomorrow, having something of importance to attend to, so I will sleep on the squab in the house-place, Mrs. Hume. If I am not in for breakfast, do not wait for me, said he, and no one questioned him, although Mrs. Hume and her husband were of joint opinion that Jabez looked terribly put out, and wondered what business he could have on hand of so much consequence. No one thought of locking country cottage doors. By 9 o'clock all the inmates were in bed and asleep. Before 10, Jabez, sad at heart, had quietly left the cottage for the mill, had saddled Peveril, and though no great horseman, was speeding past the White Hart along the highway to Manchester, fast as the steady-going roadster would travel. The wind had risen and the rain came down persistently, but heedless of discomfort or danger, with the one thought paramount in his mind, the preservation of his master's daughter, he set his teeth and rode on with feverish impatience, which at length communicated itself to Peveril, and quickened the beats of the sensible animal's hoof, impatience which would have sent him flying over the toll-gates had either he or his steed been equal to the exploit, and which could barely brook the deal. Nevertheless, as he turned from Piccadilly into Mosley Street, the muffled-up old watchman, catching the echoes of the infirmary clock, bawled out to mark his own vigilance, "Just 1 o'clock and a dark, rainy night," and the Ashton household had closed its eyelids and its account with the day, at least a couple of hours. It is never pleasant to be the bearer of ill tidings, so no wonder Jabez hesitated with the lion-headed knocker in his hand, ere he sent its reverberations growling through the silent house. His hesitation must have influenced the knocker, for the lion had to roar again and louder before he heard the window above unclose, and saw Mr. Ashton's night-capped head thrust out to ask in alarm, "Who's there? What's the matter?" Jabez stepped back to the curbstone to let the dull rays of an oil lamp fall upon his face. "It is I, Jabez Clegg, sir. I have a matter of importance to communicate." "Good heavens, Clegg! You? Surely the mill's not been burned down?" "No, sir. All's right at the factory. There's no harm done anywhere at present. If you will please to come down, I hope there may be time to prevent that which is threatened." "Just so. I'll be down directly." There were no lucifer matches with which to procure instantaneous light, but during this brief colloquy Mrs. Ashton had been groping on the tall chimney-piece for their precursors, the Prometheans, and having found them by dipping a small chemically prepared match into a tiny bottle of fluid, she obtained a light as soon as the window was closed and the draught shut out. Too uneasy to waste much time in dressing, before many minutes had flown, Mr. and Mrs. Ashton, whose fears had equally pointed to their daughter, the one in her roquelaire and the other in her warehouse overall, were both listening with agitated and anxious faces to Mr. Clegg's communication, made with a discomposure great as their own. "Elope!" both parents exclaimed simultaneously. "Elope!" reiterated the mother. "Our daughter consent to elope, and with a reprobate like him? It is not possible." "So I should have said, madam, yesterday," rejoined Jabez sadly, as he sank on a chair, overpowered more by the strain on his feelings than by the fatigue of his long, wet midnight ride, and I would have given the world to have been able to doubt the evidence of my own ears. Mrs. Ashton, with clasped hands, sat opposite to Jabez. Mr. Ashton, lacking the consolation and inspiration of his snuff-box, walked about the room with one hand to his head in a state of distressing perturbation. He stopped in his walk to ask, "What's to be done?" as Jabez made this declaration, unconscious of its force. The light of the chamber candle fell upon the haggard face and drenched garments of the young man. The elder one looked full at him, paused, then drawing near and laying his right hand heavily on the other's wet shoulder, asked in a troubled voice, with an inquisitorial but not unkind manner, "My lad, did no other motive than duty to your employers bring you 18 miles through the rain this dark night to save Miss Ashton from an imprudent marriage?" Jabez had not stopped to analyse his own motives. Thus questioned, it was not without embarrassment that he answered, "Mrs. Ashton desired me, sir, to watch over Miss Ashton and acquaint you with any matter affecting her welfare. But apart from that, sir, I could not see Miss Ashton in the coils of a libertine without an attempt to rescue her. I should have been a dastard to sit passive, and even now I feel we are losing time." Just so, assented Mr. Ashton. "That reminds me, Peveril is in the street, and you are soaked to the skin. My dear," turning to his wife, "will you arouse the servants and see that neither horse nor rider suffers in our service more than we can help?" Having thus got rid of his wife, of whom he stood somewhat in awe, he resumed his searching catechism of Jabez. "And so, Clegg, you have no motive beyond a chivalrous desire to save your master's daughter, no interest to serve beyond your duty to us?" The ordeal was terrible. Jabez rose, his features working convulsively. "Mr. Ashton, you are torturing me. Humble as I am, I love Miss Ashton with my whole life and soul, but knowing the distance between us, I have striven to keep the secret in my own breast, and I protest I had no double motive in my journey hither." The genial small-ware manufacturer, to whom that night had brought 2 revelations, looked Jabez steadfastly in the face as he made his avowal. Then, taking him kindly by the hand, said, his eyes swimming, just so, my lad, I believe you, and Jabez Clegg, let me tell you that I would rather give my daughter to an upright, persevering man like you without a penny than to a spendthrift like Lawrence Aspinall, though he roll in riches. But it is no use saying that now." Indeed, there was no use, and time was flying. A glance of grateful attachment and a mute pressure of his liberal master's hand were the sole acknowledgment of Jabez. But a new bond was established between the twain. Mrs. Ashton had come back to discuss with her husband and Jabez the best mode of procedure. She was not less shrewd than her lord, and had not failed to perceive that the young man's heart was in the service he now rendered them. The blow dealt by Augusta to her pride dashed down the impalpable barrier between them, and she took counsel with him as a tried and true friend. Mr. Clegg pointed out the necessity for his return to the mill before it should open and he be missed, and taking a proffered glass of brandy and water to avert cold, he hurried, whilst hot coffee was preparing, to change his soaked garments preparatory to the ride back, his elders also taking the opportunity to dress and prepare for departure with the morning coach. Not a moment was wasted, but though Peveril had been well groomed and fed, he was not so fresh to the road as he had been. Still, the journey was homeward. The rain had abated, day began to dawn as he left Stockport behind, and without much use of the whip, Jabez had his horse back in the stable before the factory bell began to ring, and then the beast was allowed to rest. The jaded man had to rouse himself to another day's work, another day's trial and excitement, without a moment for repose. To everybody's astonishment, Mr. and Mrs. Ashton stepped out of the Lord Nelson coach that morning at the bottom of the avenue with a carpet bag for luggage. The difference of their reception by daughter and niece was palpable, and they could not fail to observe how much the former was disconcerted by their arrival. "Oh, aunt and uncle, this is a pleasant surprise!" exclaimed Ellen, running down the avenue to meet them. "You do not appear very well pleased to see us, Augusta," remarked Mrs. Ashton, as she met her, lazily sauntering through the garden towards them, as captivating in her printed morning dress as a sleepless night, an anxious headache, and her unmistakable confusion would permit the recognized beauty to be. "Oh yes, I am pleased enough, but I should have been better pleased if you had written instead of coming upon one so suddenly. It is quite startling," and the petulance of her tone gave effect to the pettish frown on her brow. "My dear, ill thoughts make ill looks," said Mrs. Ashton gravely, with a searching glance. "What is the matter with you this morning? Nothing serious, I hope?" The very inquiry apparently annoyed her. "Oh, I've got a headache, that's all. I heard a man's foot on the gravel walk long after everyone was in bed, and I got a fright." "I think it was only Crazy Joe. He hangs about at all hours," put in Ellen, who had not heard the crunch of Mr. Clegg's heel on the gravel, as he stood for a moment under their window to breathe a prayer for the safety and well-being of the supposed sleeper, before he turned away swiftly on his errand. Almost Mr. Ashton's first inquiry was for Mr. Clegg. "He's at the mill, sir. He was off afore any on us was up, and he said happen he mightn't get home for breakfast, he was so busy," was the reply of Bess. But Mr. Ashton, setting off towards the factory, encountered Jabez on the way, and they returned together to breakfast, as if they'd met for the first time that morning. On Mrs. Ashton's suggestion, Augusta was neither questioned nor accused. "We should only tempt her to deny, and perhaps provoke ill will towards our informant, with no good end," she said. "Better wait and ascertain beyond question what her intentions are." Jabez would fain have spared her the pain and shame of exposure, but the matter was out of his hands. The day passed unmarked, save by Augusta's restless lookout for Crazy Joe, and the way she hung about her mother, as if half afraid of the rash step she contemplated. Mr. Ashton, meanwhile, to cover his distress and agitation, busied himself about the transfer of the White Hart, which he pronounced admirable, to its place over the inn door, and managed to elicit from Chapman, the gossiping landlord, without direct inquiry, that a fine young spark in hunting gear had put up his horse there several times within the past week, and was like to make the fortune of Crazy Joe. He gave the poor softy so many half-crowns, but Joe was deep, and never let on what he got them for. Chapter 38. Defeated. Jabez Clegg and the young ladies occupied adjoining chambers, the two inner rooms of the suite, but the door of communication was locked, and they were attained by different staircases. Thus, as he was compelled to pass through the Humes' sleeping apartment, so Ellen and Augusta were constrained to go backwards and forwards through that of Mr. and Mrs. Ashton, an arrangement long use had probably reconciled them to. It was this fact which had so much disconcerted Augusta, since she foresaw a difficulty in escaping unheard, and not meeting with Joe, that most unpromising of Cupids. She was as equally unable to convey a message to her expectant lover. She repented her rash promise, and would fain have availed herself of a pretext for delay, but the night came, and, haunted by imaginary pictures of Lawrence with a pistol to his head, she dared not disappoint him. She had promised to meet him at the entrance of the Lovers' Walk, which opened below Yearsley Hall Farm into Moor Lane, whilst the lane being a steep declivity, he was to keep the post-chaise in waiting at the foot. Her headache served as an excuse for retiring to bed earlier than her cousin, and scarcely could her father and mother restrain themselves as she kissed them lingeringly before she went. Indeed, Mr. Ashton would much have preferred to have it out with the girl at once and have done with it, there not being much waiting blood in his veins. He had kept out of her sight most of the day, fidgeting over one thing and another, whilst his waistcoat and shirt frill bore testimony to the constant raid on his snuff-box. "I don't like to see my poor lass trapped like a bird in a cage," he said in confidence to Jabez, whose opinion he already knew agreed with his own, as did the desire to thrash the infernal scoundrel within an inch of his life. The last straw had broken the camel's back, and Jabez was no longer inclined to be passive. Lawrence had bid Augusta to take no care for her wardrobe. His purse was ample, and he would dress her like a queen if she would only consent to fly with him. So, after collecting a few immediate necessaries and trinkets, and placing the reticule which contained them out of sight, she crept into bed to lie and listen for the household to follow her example. How lazily the hours lagged! She heard old Simon shuffling about, and the creaking of his camp bedstead as he settled his old rheumatic bones for the night. But the firm foot of Jabez she did not hear, though the house clock struck 9, and Ellen came up with the last stroke. In answer to a question, Ellen said that Mr. Clegg was asleep on the squab, and that she understood he had slept there the previous night, to be able to go to the mill very early without disturbing anyone else. "I saw him as he lay there, where he had fallen asleep shortly after tea, and I have been speaking to my uncle about him. He looks so dreadfully worn and jaded. I am sure he is either killing himself with overwork, or has some great trouble on his mind," and a deep sigh followed this expression of opinion. Augusta was silent. Something within her secret heart whispered that the trouble of Jabez Clegg would be intensified sevenfold by her act of that night. And haughty as she was betimes, she pitied him, and whatever were her compunctions, fears, or emotions, Jabez certainly shared with her parents in her thoughts. Ellen slept. The clock struck 10. Father and mother entered their room, and through the door which Augusta had artfully requested Ellen to leave open on account of the heat, came the sound of their voices in low but earnest converse. "You leave her to me, William," spoken with decision, being the only words she could distinguish, though she heard her father walk about for some time. Indeed, she thought he would never go to bed. 11. She slipped stealthily from the side of her sleeping cousin, and by the light of the moon, clear enough tonight, dressed as noiselessly and rapidly as her trepidation would permit. From habit she knelt to pray, but as she came to the passage, "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil," a new meaning seemed to flash through the words, and she half wavered in her purpose. "Poor Jabez," she murmured to herself as she caught up her shoes and reticule, and listened in the open doorway for the deep breathing which came from behind the dimity curtains of the four-post bed. Reassured, she stepped lightly across the room in her stocking feet, turned the drop-handle of that chamber door as silently as the squeaking latch would permit, and fled swiftly down the stairs, sitting down at the bottom to put on her shoes. She had raised the sash, and was in the very act of stepping over the low window-sill, when a foot was heard on the stair, and turning her head, she saw her mother fully dressed close by her side, and felt her slight wrists grasped as in a vice. "Is this your filial love and obedience, misguided girl? Is this the result of Madame Broadbent's training? Have you no more sense of honour and decency than to elope at midnight with any man, least of all with the worthless reprobate who has caught your silly fancy? Could you not think that chastity is the brightest jewel in a woman's crown, and the soonest dimmed, that you were ready to leave your character at the mercy of every gossip who had a tongue to wag?" She had drawn Augusta, too much stunned to speak, into the parlour close at hand, and had shut the doors, a needless precaution, seeing how remote were all sleepers. A few words of gentle motherly inquiry might have softened impulsive, tender-hearted Augusta to tears and turned the whole current of her life, but Mrs. Ashton's stateliness had become sternness, and, fresh from the evil teaching of Lawrence Aspinall, her daughter's proud spirit rose in rebellion and answered her. "We are going to be married, and I was not going with Lawrence alone. Cicely was to travel with us. Lawrence himself proposed it." "Infatuated girl!" exclaimed Mrs. Ashton. "Cicely was in Mosley Street last night." "And so were you, mother," was the smart retort. "But the coach which dropped you here carried her to Buxton. Outside passengers were muffled up, but she waved her handkerchief as she passed, as a sign to me." "Sign to you, indeed! I marvel you are not ashamed of yourself and your hero, who is not content with corrupting my daughter, but must corrupt our servants also. A fine hero indeed, whose qualifications are all external. I cannot see what there is to admire in him." "Not see what there is to admire in that exquisite figure and beautiful face? Why, I shall be the envy of half the girls in Manchester when I marry him," Augusta explained, with anything but the air of a culprit just detected. "But you are not likely to marry him, you forward chit. You go back to Manchester tomorrow, and I will take good care you don't marry either clandestinely or openly a man so sure to make your heart ache, if he were thrice as handsome." "But I will marry him, mamma. I'll please my eye if I plague my heart." "Then, as you make your bed, so you must lie, miss," answered Mrs. Ashton gravely and deliberately. "But take my word for it, neither your papa nor myself will give our consent. And now go to your room, Augusta, and thank God you have been saved from disgrace this night, and thank us that we have kept you from open exposure. Not even your cousin has a notion of this last folly. Our daughter's honour is dearer to us than to herself," and the mother's tone softened as she spoke. "Your daughter's honour has never been in any danger," said Augusta haughtily, as she swept from the room, to encounter at the foot of the stairs, flooded by moonlight through the open window, her father and Jabez. Up to that moment she had stood on the defensive, her wayward spirit upholding and harming her for retort. The sight of the father, who had indulged her every whim, and of Jabez, whose esteem she valued more than she herself knew, gave a sudden shock to her overwrought nerves, and she fell forward into the arms of Jabez in a deep swoon. Tenderly, respectfully, sadly, he bore her into the parlour, and placing her on the sofa, relinquished her to her mother, divesting himself of his shoes in order to procure water to restore her without creating alarm. When she recovered, he was gone. She was alone with the parents whose counsels she despised, whose love she had wounded, herself detected and humiliated. A greater humiliation had fallen to the lot of elate, enamoured, and self-satisfied Lawrence Aspinall, when leaving his friend Barrett with the post-chaise, their saddle-horses, and Cicely at the bottom of Moor Lane, he mounted the hill and whistled softly at the entrance of the Lovers' Walk, to call forth not a blushing maiden, half afraid of her own temerity, but two justly incensed and indignant men. His low-voiced "Augusta" died upon his lips. He recoiled, stammered, "You! I did not damnation! What brought you here? I thought—" "Just so, you atrocious scoundrel! You thought God had left our pet lamb to the fangs of the wolf, and that neither father nor friend was near to protect the innocent," exclaimed Mr. Ashton, raising the stout bamboo with which he was provided. "If that infernal Cicely has betrayed us, I'll—" The threat was not completed, for Jabez interrupted him with, "No, sir, it was not Cicely. You betrayed yourself. You laid bare your whole scheme in this walk within my hearing. Mr. Lawrence Aspinall, and the sophistry which misled a simple, confiding girl could not delude one who knew you as I do." "Damnation!" hissed Lawrence between his teeth. "You infernal charity school whelp! Am I to meet you at every turn? I suppose you want Miss Ashton for yourself, but I'll balk you yet." And but that Jabez had a quick eye and hand, his riding whip would have seamed the latter's manly face. Jabez dexterously caught the whip and wrenched it from him, a simultaneous sharp blow of Mr. Ashton's bamboo on Aspinall's shoulders tending to loosen his grasp, and then the two young men, with all the fever of jealousy added to old animosity, closed and grappled with each other as might a lion and a tiger in the arena, and Mr. Ashton, his love of fair play yielding to his exasperation, made good use of his bamboo whenever he could deal a blow without harming Jabez. The two combatants were not unequally matched. There was little difference in size and weight, but the scientific skill of Lawrence had more than a counterpoise in the nerve and muscle of Jabez, strengthened by exercise and a temperate life, whilst vicious courses had somewhat impaired his own athletic frame. The struggle on the steep hillside was too deadly for noise. At length Lawrence himself, booted and spurred, in striving to take an unfair advantage, and ripped the unprotected calves of Jabez with the rowels of his spurs, lost his foothold, and was borne to the earth, falling heavily. He lay on the ground, stunned and motionless. At once Jabez, with a swift revulsion of feeling, knelt down by the side of his prostrate foe and raised his head, Mr. Ashton bending over them inquiringly, just as Barrett, whom curiosity and impatience had drawn from his post below, came on the scene. A stifled groan and a muttered curse having assured Clegg that his rival was not mortally injured, he called to Barrett, "Here, sir, take charge of your worthy principal, and be careful when next you plan an elopement, that you have not a man to deal with instead of a credulous girl." Mr. Ashton's "Just so" coming sharply in as chorus, the young man put his arm in that of the elder, and drew him away, leaving Barrett and the postilion to restore Lawrence Aspinall, and assist him into the post-chaise by the side of Cicely, whose trepidation would have been very much increased, could she have seen how the blood was trickling down from a wound in his head, staining still more the torn miry coat and the disordered shirt frill over which he was usually so fastidious. Barrett, leading his companion's horse, rode on in advance of the vehicle, to prepare the pompous gentleman laid up with the gout in Buxton Crescent for the reception of his gentlemanly son in a highly gentlemanlike condition, hatless, wigless, dirty, dilapidated, bruised, bloody, and unsuccessful. The hat had rolled downhill to be crushed under the wheels of the chaise. The wig and broken whip were found the next morning by Crazy Joe, who exercised his witless head respecting them, and the trampled ground to small purpose, then brought them to his friend Syme as playthings. Had they fallen into the hands of a reasoning mortal, much more perplexity and a very serious mystery might have been the result. Buxton being only 5 miles from Whaley Bridge, Barrett again made his appearance in the neighbourhood of the White Hart, whilst the new sign still attracted rustic admirers, and, finding no rumours current respecting the occurrence of the preceding night, he rode off again, having first committed to Crazy Joe a scarcely decipherable missive from the discomfited lover to the not less disconsolate damsel. The evening coach bore the Ashtons and Helen back to Manchester, Augusta still in a rebellious mood, the cause of which, being hidden from her cousin, occasioned the latter no little perplexity. There was something too in the manner of her uncle and aunt to Jabez, and of Jabez to all, which, being undefinable and impalpable, struck her as peculiar. He seemed suddenly to have risen to another footing. How was it they had taken him into their confidence? Not until the last moment, when attention was distracted by the bustle at the inn door, the disposal of the luggage and the taking of seats, would Crazy Joe, with cunning worthy a better cause, contrive to slip the billet-doux into Miss Ashton's reticule, unseen by all but herself. Not until she reached her own room in Mosley Street could she scan its characteristic contents, which ran as follows: Crescent, Buxton, September 1821. Adored Augusta, excuse this scrawl. I can scarcely hold my pen in consequence of a ruffianly attack made upon me by your father's favourite factotum, Jabez Clegg, in Moor Lane last night. Can you disclose to me the strange fatality which kept you from my expectant arms, and revealed our plans to that upstart foundling. Had not Mr. Ashton also struck at me with a stick, I could readily have disposed of his assistant, but my foot tripped over a stone, and falling I lay at their mercy. Yet, sweet Augusta, if my blood flowed, it was for thy sake, and for thy sake I endure. Be constant, be firm, let no tyranny coerce you, and I will make a way for our union. If I steal you from their very midst, I have a dislocated ankle, a bruised and swollen hand, a plastered crown, and I write painfully. I shall feel every hour a year until I hold you in my arms again. But if my angelic Augusta be only true to her promise, she will soon, in spite of spies and informers, be the adored wife of her most devoted Lawrence. Chapter 39. Like father, like son. It is no uncommon thing for a woman to gild a block, wreathe it with flowers, and then fall down and worship the idol she has adorned. Augusta's hero needed no outward embellishment, so she fitted the fair exterior with the perfections and virtues of the high-spirited, noble, generous Mortimers and Mowbrays, whose acquaintance she had made in print, and had set him on a very elevated pedestal, in spite of all warnings. With that misleading letter of his before her, no wonder if the blood shed for her sweet sake converted the hero into the martyr, and placed Jabez and her father in the category of cruel persecutors. It did more. It erected a barrier against reconciliation. In vain her placable father held out a flag of truce. She kept aloof resentfully, though in the solitude of her own chamber she gave way and wept at her isolation from all who loved her. Mrs. Ashton, whose sense of propriety had been outraged, whose maternal pride had received a terrible shock, was less readily disposed to condone her daughter's offence, and being a better business woman than a psychologist, her tactics showed none of her ordinary shrewdness. The failure of Augusta's banishment to Cowle should have taught her that romance is nursed in solitude, and that conciliation is better than coercion. Had she spared a few hours from the warehouse to arrange a dance, or a gypsy party to Dunham Park, chaperoned her lovely daughter to assembly, theatre, or concert room, invited her companionship in a stroll through St. Anne's Square and King Street, calling at Mrs. Edge's fashionably frequented library by the way, joined the after-morning church promenaders in the infirmary gardens, or given a little time to morning calls, she would have brought Augusta into contact with young people of her own age, and with the attractive of the opposite sex, and so have supplied an antidote for the poison Lawrence and ultra-sentimental literature had instilled. Instead, never was the golden fruit more vigilantly guarded. She was kept much within doors. There was no Sicily to sympathise or convey clandestine billet-doux. The modern notion that a daily airing is indispensable had not been promulgated, or had not become the creed of the manufacturing community. Mrs. Ashton had no leisure for gadding, and Augusta cared little to drive in the gig with only James for her charioteer, or even to walk with Ellen, so long as the mulberry-coloured livery was in attendance. It might have been otherwise, had not the said James held it as much beneath his dignity to accept a bribe, as he had formerly done to wait upon Mr. Clegg. From her old bedroom, which overlooked Mosley Street, she was relegated to one in the rear, which commanded no wider prospect than their own courtyard, nor anything more interesting than Nelson and his kennel. By the by, Nelson had been in favour since the sad accident on the ice. Then visits to Marsden Square were prohibited, lest she should there meet John Walmsley's undesirable friend, and, altogether, her escapade had converted home into a cage, in spite of its gilding. As might have been expected, the high-spirited, wayward girl, so long her father's pet, so long indulged in her caprices, chafed and rebelled against every fresh token of restraint, and contrasted the dull monotony of her life with the freedom and gaiety promised so frequently by Lawrence, as the certain concomitants of wifehood with him. With all her haughty spirit, she had a clinging, affectionate nature, tinged though it was with poetry and romance. And now that her father looked so unusually grave, and her mother so frigid, and she felt herself an alien from both their hearts, instead of bewailing her premeditated flight as a crime, the tendrils of her love only clung closer to him who professed so much, and the more she was isolated from them, the more she brooded on the ill-used and maligned Lawrence, his manly beauty and accomplishments, his lavish generosity, his fascinations of voice and manner, and the fervour of his passion for her. Meanwhile, Tom Hume had resumed his duties at Whaley Bridge Mill, and Jabez returned home to his. Much to Augusta's surprise, he was not only invited to dine with them on the day of his return, but to take his place henceforth at their board as one of the family. With Lawrence's misrepresentations fixed in her mind as truths, she construed the daily association thus thrust upon her as a deliberate affront, and resented it with a silent scorn which cut Jabez to the soul. He knew nothing of Aspinall's letter, or that he was accused of a ruffianly attack. He only felt that he would have died to serve her, and had done what he had to save her from lifelong misery, without a single thought of keeping her for himself. A few more days, and back to Manchester came Mr. Aspinall, senior, having left a little of his portliness with his gout in the Buxton Baths. Back with him came his son, and his son's congenial companion, Mr. Edmund Barrett, the former still smarting under his defeat at Carr, and all the more resolutely determined to carry off Augusta, jealousy adding a new element to his love, a new element to his hate. Sitting idly by the parlour window on the 3rd of October, with her head leaning against the frame, meditating on her own unhappiness and her parents' harshness, Augusta suddenly started to her feet with a suppressed cry of delight, a vivid glow upon her cheeks, a brilliant sparkle in her eye. Lawrence Aspinall, mounted on Black Ralph, his favourite hunter, was riding up the street, the dislocated ankle apparently not affecting his enjoyment of equestrian exercise. As he raised his new beaver in graceful salutation, even the flutter into which she was thrown could not prevent her missing his glorious curls. He had not deemed it necessary to replace his wig, and the pole, shorn during fever, had not yet grown a fresh crop ripe for harvest. The unfavourable impression passed with the moment, as he brought his obedient steed on the flagged pavement close under the window, and without a moment's hesitation she raised the sash and leaned forward to speak with him, glad of the opportunity. "Oh, Lawrence, my own Augusta, this is indeed fortunate." Their hands clasped upon the window-sill, the elevation of the house raising her to his level. Her tearful eyes looked up in his for traces of suffering after the ruffianly attack, and found there, mingled with the fierce light of violent love, a bitter sense of defeat, a resolve to obtain her by fair means or foul. Each had the separate experience of that memorable September night to relate, coloured as passion or prejudice prevailed, but neither could fully enlighten the other as to the share Mr. Clegg had had in preventing the elopement. He could tell her that Jabez had avowed overhearing their conversation in the Lovers' Walk, though where he could have been to overhear, or what strange fatality could bring Mr. and Mrs. Ashton to Carr in time to become the recipients of his eavesdropping and defeat their plans, was a puzzle to both. Be sure Lawrence put the worst colour on the encounter in the lane, and urged all he had himself endured to strengthen his claims upon her, claims she was quite willing to admit, had she the power to concede to them. Having shown with very evident annoyance how impossible it was for her to meet or give him a private interview, he exclaimed with indignation, "What? Not allowed to visit a relation or to go abroad without a jailer? My dearest Augusta, this is a cruel state of captivity. But my bird must not be allowed to fray her beautiful plumage in beating against the bars of her cage. I must devise a better plan for her escape." Any means are justifiable to obtain release from tyranny like this. What says my love? Is she still willing to trust her Lawrence? To the death, she whispered emphatically. You are alone here every morning? Her lips could barely frame a yes, when a voice and step in the hall warned her to close the window with a hurried gesture to him, and before Mrs. Ashton, who had lingered to give an order to James, could enter the room, Black Ralph was cantering towards the portico, and Augusta occupied with the third volume of Alinda, or the Child of Mystery. Very little escaped Mrs. Ashton's eye. The clatter of hoofs on the flags, audible through the thick front door, had left no sensible impression on her brain, but the heightened colour of Augusta attracted her attention at once. She brought a work-basket from the panel cupboard, took thence a strip of cambric muslin, and handed it to her daughter. "My dear," said she quietly, "all play makes no hay. Your eyes are younger than mine, and I think it will do you more good to hem your father's shirt frills than to pore over sentimental books from morning until night. So much romance reading is not good for you. I see that you are quite flushed and excited over the one you are perusing now." There was a sharp rat-a-tat-tat on the lion's head, and in burst Mr. Ashton, much more flushed and excited than his daughter. He had met Mr. Lawrence on Black Ralph just as he was quitting the portico after an angry discussion with Mr. Aspinall the elder. "You are quite right, my dear, in saying like father, like son," cried he, "for I'll swallow my snuff-box if that pompous old cotton merchant did not justify his scapegrace son in his attempt to carry off our Augusta. He said that the end justified the means, that we ought to be proud of such an alliance." Mrs. Ashton's lip curled. That he was glad Miss Ashton had more discernment than her parents, that his boy had set his heart upon her, and should not be thwarted in his choice by any beggar's inkle-weaver in England. And no sooner had I left him in the reading-room to digest my opinion on the subject, and put my foot on the steps of the portico, than up rode young Hopeful, and took off his hat to me, bowing down to his black horse's mane. Having delivered himself of this explosive intelligence, Mr. Ashton walked about and sought a sedative in his snuff-box, and Augusta, who, folding the hem of the frill, had not lost one word, said dryly, "I think Mr. Aspinall's justification of his son's design may at least be taken as a vindication of Mr. Lawrence's honourable intentions, of which so many doubts have been expressed, and the bell equally absolves Lawrence from a charge of malice." With a proud toss of her shapely head, she walked towards the dining-room, rejecting the proffered arm of Jabez, who had entered the parlour whilst Mr. Ashton was speaking, and thus closed a discussion which could not be continued in the presence of servants. Jabez, on his return from Carr, had found his rough old clerical friend confined to his room, seriously ill. Tabitha was worn out with his humours and eccentricities, and was glad when the young man offered to relieve her twice or thrice a week, and old Joshua welcomed him as a relief from the monotonous garrulity of an unlettered old woman. Jabez could bring him news of another stamp. Through Ben Travis, who had discovered that activity was the best antidote to melancholy, he kept him informed of the progress of the incipient temperance movement, in which the parson took uncommon interest. Through Mr. Ashton, he kept him au courant of town politics, and for general intelligence he brought newspapers with him to be read, interrupted by many and unique commentaries. In order that Tabitha might obtain repose, Mr. Clegg usually remained until a late hour, Mrs. Ashton herself entrusting him with a latchkey on these occasions. One night towards the middle of October, when Joshua had been more than ordinarily crusty, and Jabez did not quit the classic corner until the wee short hours ayont the 12, he was struck as he turned the corner from Market Street into Mosley Street to find Mr. Aspinall's carriage in waiting with 4 horses and postilions. He stood still for a moment to reassure himself, but carriages were not so common that he should mistake that particular one, and his heart drummed an alarm within his breast. Hurrying on with sad misgivings, he passed 2 tall figures muffled in cloaks, whom he had no difficulty in recognizing, from build and walk, to be the Aspinalls, father and son, and increasing his speed he gained the door, inserted his key in the latch, and was on the stairs before the cloaked individuals had finished their speculations respecting his being a robber escaped from a constable. Formerly Augusta had to pass his room door to reach her own, on the opposite side of the long corridor. Her new chamber was next to his own and nearer to the staircase. A thin stream of light shot through the keyhole, and a bright narrow line cast upon the opposite wall showed the door ajar. He stood still in his surprise. As if a tipsy, musically disposed man were going past, the refrain of a rollicking song was trolled out in the street, and then Augusta, equipped as for a journey, came forth from her chamber to descend the stairs. She had calculated on the signal an hour earlier, and expected Jabez an hour later. As she stole on tiptoe down the stairs, Jabez confronted her and barred her progress. A silver candlestick dropped from her hand with the one word, "Again," and rolling down with a clang awakened Mr. and Mrs. Ashton, the only sleepers on that floor, and set Nelson barking furiously. They were in the dark, but he had caught her hand. "Miss Ashton, this is infatuation, madness." "No matter, sir, let me pass. You have no right to detain me." "But I have, miss," said her father, coming behind, guided by their voices, his scant apparel as invisible in the gloom as himself. "Is this another attempt to disgrace us by eloping? Oh, my child, you are breaking your poor old father's heart." "And mine," floated like the echo of despair's last sigh from the lips of Jabez. But the utter hopelessness of the old man's tone touched a sensitive chord of Augusta's soul, and turning she fell upon his neck, crying tearfully, "Oh, forgive me, father, forgive me. I did not think you would take it so much to heart." The appeal of affection to affection had accomplished what reason and authority had failed to effect.